The Science of Unbelief, Chapter 3. We come now to a study of the real nature, origin, and meaning of unbelief, keeping in mind our definition that unbelief is the incapacity of the skeptical mind to accept or understand any phenomena belonging to what is usually understood as the supernatural sphere, in which are included our conception of a personal God, inspiration or revelation, miracles, prophecy, and prayer. A close observation and study of human character and mentality convinces us of two prevailing errors: the ideal or typical infidel and the real genuine hypocrite are supposed to be common types of men. This is not so. Both are comparatively rare. They are not to be met with at every street corner. It is a cheering reflection that we meet with very few Uriah Heeps and with comparatively few religious hypocrites, men who steal the livery of heaven in order that they may wear it in the service of the devil. The majority of those whom the world regards as hypocrites are specimens of weak Christians, often with high ideals up to the standard of which they are unable to live, and their frequent falls are accepted as proof of their utter insincerity and hypocrisy, whilst we should consider them as objects of pity, demanding help instead of scorn. We shall see presently how similar considerations apply to the type of a good man commonly regarded as an infidel. If unbelief, then, be a comparatively rare thing, why all this hubbub about its rapid spread inside and outside the church? Real unbelief cannot be propagated like a mushroom or fungus. There must be no confusion here. The German higher criticism is the product of unadulterated infidelity, as explained in the former address. Men living at variance with the will and laws of God seize gladly upon its crude theories and baseless assertions, greedily swallowing them in order to set conscience asleep, just as the opium eater dopes himself with laudanum to indulge in a few hours of lethe. The clear thinker will presently see that the narcotic laudanum corresponds in the simile, not the real infidelity or atheism, for it is something very different. If we change the simile to a metaphor, still using a medical phraseology, we may call this something conscience salve. Everyone meets with men who delight in aggressively and often offensively airing their opinions on the absurdity of accepting any of the before-mentioned varieties of supernatural phenomena included in our definition of unbelief. We leave out of consideration the honest doubter. He is in another category, and moreover, he is, as a rule, ominously silent about his religious or spiritual perplexities. It is the privilege of the observant physician to see deeper into true character than most men, even including clergymen. How often do we find the boastful or blatant unbeliever change his note on the advent of some suddenly prostrating illness, and notice how he blanches in terror when the dark messenger, cloaked from head to foot, is waiting for him in the antechamber to lead him to the judgment seat of his Creator. The totally God-blind skeptic or rationalist has no bands in his death. As a general rule, you may take the following to be an explanation of the condition of heart and mind of the type of man commonly regarded as an infidel or rationalist, or as he delights sometimes to call himself, a free thinker. He is a man with a conscience which tells him daily and hourly that he is living in open or secret sin, in violation of God's laws. He has always a fair and often a good knowledge of these laws. Probably in his better days, he has struggled hard against his moral weakness, but he has long since given up the struggle as hopeless. As he feels the worm gnawing at his heart, His only relief is to borrow and wrap himself in the mantle of unbelief. It is his great comfort to hold forth loudly on the doctrine of the non existence of a God, so as to silence the still small voice that will make itself heard. As he talks and declaims, he gets ease. If you happen to have such a friend, watch him closely. The more vocal his infidelity becomes, the more certain you may feel that your friend has a skeleton in his cupboard. And the more hopeful you may become that the worm is biting deeper, and the brighter grows the prospect of his being enabled to snap his bonds asunder. Though few things give him such joy as to gloat over the fall of some prominent Christian, or the moral wreck of some professing friend's life, don't be tempted to give up such a man as hopeless. He is not altogether bad. Always remember that it is the germ of belief within him which makes him repulsive to you. Be sure he is closely watching every action of your own life, and perhaps without a word spoken by you, your consistent conduct may save an immortal soul. But I am preaching and must return to the consideration of real unbelief from a scientific standpoint. Though the view I shall strive to put before you is derived from my own professional experience, I do not venture to expound it without having given it years of serious reflection, and do not fear to criticize it closely, though I may have to speak to you of facts in anatomy, histology, and physiology. I shall avoid, if possible, using medical terms, and strive to keep the subject within the grasp of anyone who knows nothing of these ologies or sciences. You all know that we keep up our relationships with the outer world through our 5 special senses: sight, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. Probably some of the inferior animals, such as the dog, are endowed with additional senses which we humans cannot yet comprehend or understand. I propose to draw your attention to some abnormalities, deficiencies, or partial failures in these senses, especially in those of sight and hearing. But be it remembered that corresponding irregularities are common to all the senses. Only the train of thought and argument will be more easily understood and followed if we confine our remarks to the senses of sight and hearing. The senses are not the simple attributes which many people think. They are composite gifts. All of them have 2 or more functions or offices to fulfill. They are each beautifully elaborated or developed in accordance with the beneficent design of an all-wise creator, so that his creatures may be enabled to enjoy the wonderful glory of beauty and harmony with which he has so bountifully clothed the earth. Thus, in the case of sight, it is not merely a sense of light or its negative, darkness, but the power of appreciating all the beauties of every shade of color and infinite perspective. The ear is not merely a registering organ for noise or silence. Such qualities of sounds as rhythm, harmony, pitch, and timbre or quality are capable of being differentiated and appreciated by this organ when in a state of perfect development. Apparently, the simplest sense is that of touch. But here again, it is not only a matter of registering whether an object is rough or smooth, hard or soft, but also we are able to appreciate its temperature and other physical qualities. Similarly, the tongue is required not only to tell us whether a substance is bitter or sweet, but also in conjunction with the palate, it gives us accurate knowledge of a long range of flavors. The same laws hold good for the function of smelling, which to some fortunate individuals opens up a world of gratifying odors from which many less favored individuals are more or less shut out. Let us first look at the interesting defect in vision known as color blindness. You have all heard something about it, or possibly have known some friend who tells you that the scarlet berries of the holly are to him of the same color as the bright green leaves surrounding them. Few people outside the ranks of the specialist or physician can be aware of the various varieties of this visual deficiency, nor would it be profitable for you to listen to a lecture on the scientific divisions or classifications of color blindness, based upon an analysis of the colors in the rainbow. Fortunately, this is not necessary for our purpose. Note the first point, which constitutes an important link in our chain of argument or evidence. The defect is congenital. That means that the individual is born with the deficiency. It is seldom hereditary, which means that it is not often handed down from parent to offspring. It has no connection with disease and no relation whatever with the jaundiced eye, which is supposed to see everything as yellow or green, a mere poetic fallacy. It is a fairly common condition in its minor forms and may exist in a person who is unaware of his defect till he be called upon to undergo the eye test necessary for all who wish to enter the naval or railway services. Instead of giving you a lecture on color blindness, I shall simplify the whole matter by selecting out of many one marked instance occurring in a highly intellectual Christian gentleman whom I have very intimately known for many years. In his early days in the Royal Navy, he won the prize for his ship for rapidity and accuracy in reading the color signals. This seems a marvelous and almost incredible achievement for a colorblind youth. I mention it to emphasize the almost abnormal acuteness of his vision. And in some respects, it will help you to realize the good qualities of his mental equipment, which enabled him to allow quickly for his own conscious deficiency in being able to recognize the colors of the various flags. I felt that possibly he exaggerated his own defects unconsciously. One bright autumn day, we were standing in the porch of his house on a pavement of richly colored encaustic tiles, when it occurred to me to try a very simple experiment by way of a test. There was a glorious blue tile at his feet, and plucking a single leaf of the small-leaved Virginia creeper of the brightest vermilion red, I placed it in the center of the blue tile and asked him what he had to say about their colors. He laughed heartily and exclaimed, "Doctor, you have made a mistake this time. You thought to catch me, but this is a leaf, and therefore I know it must be green." "But what about the color of the tile?" "It is the same," he said, "as the leaf, only one is a little darker or lighter than the other. Now, when I look closely at them, I think they are of the same color, which my wife called gray when she was showing me some ribbons lately." The recognition of the mere name of a color affords no test. Scientists know that the seat of this defect is situated in the delicate screen or thin layer at the back of the eyeball, the retina, or possibly in the nerve of sight, somewhere between the eyeball and the brain. Some minute cells or fibers, or an infinitesimally small amount of a chemical substance is absent, which should be present in the perfectly developed visual organ, and which the microscope up to the present fails to locate. Let us next examine the hearing sense. The instances here of a very special defect are as numerous as blackberries, and the degrees and the extent of the deficiency are also very varied. Everyone is familiar with individuals who possess an indifferent, poor, or bad ear for music, but few who have not specially studied the subject can realize the extent to which this deficiency may be present without the individual being conscious of his deprivation. We call the defect in its advanced form music deafness. It is in no way associated with ordinary deafness or dullness of hearing, or with intellectual obtuseness in distinguishing sounds which are non-musical. It is a very simple thing. It means inability to distinguish differences in pitch, which is quite a different matter from failure to recognize delicate shades of differences in tone, timbre, or quality in two given sounds. As in color blindness, the individual is born into the world with this defect. Probably it is more frequently hereditary, or handed down from parent to offspring than is the visual incapacity to recognize colors. We see many cases, however, crop up in the families of highly musical parents where one child is found to be totally music deaf. And that one is often the smartest in the group with the keenest hearing power, and he may even be dreaded by the elders as the smartest pitcher with the largest ears. We may briefly study music deafness by looking at a rather exaggerated instance of it in an individual known intimately by me during almost the entire length of my own life. Therefore, I can go into details with confidence. He was brought up from infancy in a highly musical family, taking part in a domestic concert of sacred music nearly every Sabbath, where there were usually 3 or 4 different musical instruments sounding. He was for between 2 and 3 years the head boy in a large public school where music was also taught. I know, however, that he often shirked the routine music lesson as only a head boy could. One day the class was practicing a song whose words appealed to his fancy or imagination, and he was singing loudly and with zest when the teacher severely rebuked him for mocking, and serious trouble resulted. The court-martial, which followed, revealed to the lad's amazement that to sing up the musical scale was not to begin almost inaudibly and sing louder and louder, ending with a kind of war whoop or loud shout. His attempt to reproduce the note of a tuning fork was ludicrous, and he was puzzled and hurt to see all the boys in the school laughing at him. He has never been able to distinguish any single tune from another. Once I saw him in presence of majesty at a garden festival wearing his hat while the band was playing the national anthem, and he only discovered his mistake by seeing the others unbonnet. The further details of this youth's hearing powers must be mentioned. They are not trivialities, but bear upon our line of argument. His school was on a hill, and on the plain below and far out of sight, a weekly fair or market was held, at which usually 2 fiddlers, one a man and the other a woman, performed. He could easily distinguish and differentiate the tone of one fiddle from the other, having once watched the players at close quarters. Visiting the Crystal Palace, he accidentally wandered into a large concert hall where some hundreds of singers were joining in a sacred chorus. When without a program, he recognized amidst the babble of voices that of Foley or of Santley, whom he had once heard before, and he was able to locate the singer and hear his voice, as it were separately, from all others in the orchestra. He could probably have earned a living by judging the tones of old violins, though he could not recognize a single note. His master informed me that he was not only the best reader of poetry he had ever known, but he had utilized his marvelously accurate ear in awarding the reading prizes to other boys. How then can we account for his defect? Science tells us that it is due to the arrested development of a small group of minute nerve cells, not in the hearing machine within his ear, but in the brain itself. This we call the hearing or auditory center. The absence of these cells, as far as I know, has not been demonstrated in any music-deaf subject, nor do I know that the investigation has ever been pursued. But what equally helps us in working out such a problem is the fact that this hearing center in the brain is found to be withered up or wasted in people born deaf. It is interesting to notice that it is not far removed in situation from the center which enables us to exercise the faculty of speech. This boy had been born minus a portion of his minute group of nerve cells, probably not larger than a big pin's head, and consequently, he has not been able to identify a single musical note. He has, during his life, been shut out from the whole world of harmony and song. If you know such a one, do not judge him hardly by the strict dogma laid down by the author of The Merchant of Venice. Rather pity him. Though he hath no music in himself, he has the power of being moved with concord of sweet sounds. How can a study of these abnormalities of the special senses help us in getting a knowledge of the nature of unbelief or understanding the fallacies of the German higher criticism? Some philosophers attribute the power of believing in a God to what they call an innate idea, or conscience or instinct. Others think the conception may be arrived at through the operation of the reasoning powers. Instead of using such terms as innate ideas, conscience, and instinct, let us boldly regard the faculty by which we are enabled to believe in God as man's sixth sense, and see where this lands us. If the analogy of belief with the other five senses is correct, we must be able to prove its universal distribution. I think you may safely accept the fact that no people or race of savages has been discovered where minute investigation has not proved that there existed an individual conception of a God amongst them as soon as the explorer has been able to overcome the language difficulty of communicating freely with them. I remember reading about a half century ago how a tribe was found in the center of a continent in which no sense of a divine being could be made out amongst them. But a traveler rediscovered them soon after and found that the leader of the tribe had buried their gods or idols on the approach of the first traveler. I arrived at the idea that the power of accepting the supernatural should be regarded as an extra one of the five special senses from an anatomical or physiological standpoint. But I was unconscious of the fact that the theologians had arrived at a somewhat similar goal by traveling on a different road. Thus, a few weeks ago, I was surprised to find Ian McLaren had a chapter in The Mind of the Master entitled Faith, the Sixth Sense. He defines faith as the instinct of the spiritual world. The sixth sense, the sense of the unseen, one of the senses of the soul, it is the religious faculty. This encourages me in the belief that I am not straining a point by insisting on the strict analogy, though I do not forget that whilst each of our five special senses possesses a receiving apparatus at the periphery and a registering machine in its brain center, my hypothetical brain center, which registers our belief in God, is not in communication with any peripheral machinery simply because, as for the functions of all the higher brain centers, no peripheral apparatus is required. If the scientific man rejects the strictness of the analogy between this sense and the five special ones, he can reject the term special as applied to it. We have instances of people being born blind and deaf, some incapable of distinguishing odors or flavors, and some even with remarkable obtuseness of the sense of touch, amounting in rare varieties to almost absolute absence of sense of touch or temperature. Still more striking is the analogy with those instances of only partial defect of the special sense of seeing and hearing, for we meet with similar partial defects in the unbelieving individual. If we elaborated the different forms of skepticism, as we have considered the different phases of imperfection of sight and hearing, we get a flood of light upon such medleys as atheism, deism, rationalism, etc. The real atheist or total unbeliever is a man born God-blind or God-deaf. He is no more able to accept the supernatural than the music-deaf man is able to comprehend the meaning of a symphony of Beethoven, or the colorblind man to criticize a canvas of Raphael or Rubens. He stands before a page of Isaiah or Daniel exactly in the same difficulty as my friend was in when he stood in the porch of his residence, and he is equally insensible of his loss, save that the latter has learned that there is some defect in his vision which he cannot entirely comprehend, whilst the former is quite satisfied that the accumulated testimony of countless millions of Christians in all ages is the result of a delusion produced by credulous expounders of a fraudulent Bible, firm in his one religious belief that he alone with his few spiritually blind brethren is the only true interpreter of the divine will, as revealed to his chosen people in the sacred oracles of God. There's probably not a single German higher critic of the Bible belonging to the type or class under consideration. who does not give incontestable proof on almost every page of his writing that he is totally God blind or nearly so. As I have stated before, he starts his work in absolute unbelief and builds up a cardboard palace that has no more foundation than the baseless fabric of a vision, with the result that, though he does not in the least believe in miracles himself, he nevertheless is the author of the greatest miracle of the 20th century. For I can conceive of no greater miracle than to expect that any ordinary being is able to subscribe to such a tissue of puerile assumptions as goes to the making up of this so-called criticism. I am speaking of those totally God-blind critics who go the entire length of denying the existence of a personal God and Savior. There are others, like the colorblind individual, who is able to recognize some primary colors, or like the partially music deaf man, who can imperfectly learn a few tunes, who have some belief in an all-wise deity, but who are incapable of believing in the inspiration of the Bible. Others there are, again, whose faith may be equal to accepting the reality of God and inspiration or prophecy, but are wholly incapable of conceiving of the possibility of miracle. And so on through the entire gamut of infidelity, from atheism to deism, agnosticism, rationalism, materialism, free thought, and the minor or more diluted and fanciful varieties of unbelief, as the fashionable clerical type masking under the name of modernism. The God-blind man is probably an honest man, and I am convinced he is generally acting according to his light and with the aim which he thinks is the spread of what he calls truth. But what are we to say of the trimmers at home who, desiring to be considered broad scholarly men of German culture, swallow this trash without examining or digesting it, and sow the seeds of doubt in the hearts of their simple-minded hearers? This part of the Pentateuch is probably true. That is false. This book is possibly inspired. That is certainly a forgery. Without the support of a single argument save that which gives way the possibility of inspiration or revelation altogether. I am conscious that these are sweeping accusations, but when we come to consider the manner in which the critics attempt to disprove the date and authenticity of any biblical book which clashes with their crude unbelief, you will be satisfied that we are more than justified. I know some of you are thinking hard things of me and feel that it is a terrible doctrine which implies that our Heavenly Father will allow beings to be brought into the world so malformed as to be incapable of believing in Him and in His beloved Son. It will scarcely satisfy you if I point out that in violation of the developmental laws which He laid down at the creation, the lame, the halt, and the deaf, the blind, and the dumb, children without legs or arms, and with other hideous deformities appear on the earth through some variation or interference with the operation of these beneficent laws. It is not an answer to our difficulty to ask, like the foolish disciples, did this man sin, or his parents that he was born blind? We see similar developments, deformities in tame and undomesticated animals, in birds and flowering plants, and in insects. There is, my friends, a much weightier question here. It is that of personal responsibility. Is the man born without his sixth sense responsible for his own unbelief? Is he doomed from his cradle to eternal death, or can we help him? Speaking with all reverence, I feel confident that there is a satisfactory answer to this solemn question, if we face the problem boldly and in all its bearings. From what we have learned about color blindness and music deafness in the fullest degrees, you should be prepared to accept the statement that the most persevering training, teaching, or practice can never be expected to make a colorblind man paint a picture or a music deaf boy sing in tune. The machinery by which these faculties are exercised or enjoyed is totally absent in these cases. And by nothing short of a real miracle can the sense be created or replaced. It is, however, different with minor cases of deficiency in these senses. Here, the mechanism is present in a rudimentary form or undeveloped condition, and by careful and persevering training, the faculties may be cultivated to a fair extent. Every good gift which God has entrusted to man is left in our own hands, either that we may bury it in a napkin and let it decay by disuse, or augment it to perfection by continuous exercise. This was the idea embodied in the teaching about the spiritual gifts enumerated by Paul in the 12th and subsequent chapter of the first epistle to the Corinthians, as it was also in the mind of our blessed Redeemer, when in the parable of the talents he said, "Unto every one that hath shall be given, but from him that hath not, even that which he hath shall be taken away." Let us return to the consideration of the God-blind unbeliever and see if there is room for hoping for his salvation, and wherein we may be able to help him. Hard and irreverent it may seem to be that one should feel it more likely that a totally God-blind man can be more easily convinced of his deficiency than it is for the partially defective skeptic, just as it is easier to convince the completely music deaf or completely colorblind person of his developmental imperfection than it is to enlighten his only partially affected brother who is able to appreciate in some dim way variations in pitch or marked differences of color. Let us pause and consider how we might utilize this conception of a sixth sense in any attempt to help an honest unbeliever. If you approach a typical skeptic by the ordinary methods of argument and reasoning and strive to convince him that everything in the world around him and in the heavens above him proclaims the reality and the existence of a personal God, he only laughs at you or pities your credulity and ignorance. He tells you, as he tells himself, that he sees all these things and that his own reasoning powers are quite as good as your own. Indeed, he is almost certain to feel that his are better, since he was probably accepted reason as his sole deity. And he will tell you that, having examined every theological argument, he has thoroughly convinced himself irrevocably by his reason that there is no proof of such a doctrine. Against the weapons of the Christian's reasoning and experience, he is clad in triple mail. Confront him with the sword of the Spirit and show him by reasonable analogy that faith or belief, the power of accepting or understanding the supernatural, may after all be due to the presence of a sixth special sense of which he happens to be born deficient, like the colorblind or music deaf man. That this being so, he might as reasonably be expected to understand or to see God as to hear a picture, see a harmony or taste an odor. If he be open-minded, he should be staggered. If a reasonable and honest man desiring to find truth, but holding fast to his own God of reason, he will probably affirm that his logic does not teach him such nonsense. Your blow has rung upon his shield, and the next one should cleave his helm or pierce his breastplate. Now comes in the grave question of his responsibility. His confidence arises very much from his conviction that he cannot in any case be held responsible by any higher being, if there be such, so long as he honestly submits himself to the strict guidance of his reason exercised along logical lines. Oh yes, my friend, you are logical and reasonable just to the same extent as a colorblind man, guided by his reason, might enter our National Gallery and start to destroy the glorious masterpieces there, exclaiming, "I have as good or better sight than any of you, and there is no such thing as color. These paintings are fabulous." Yes, just as logical and delightfully reasonable as the music-deaf coxcomb who would endeavor to break up the performance of an oratorio on the ground that his own hearing powers were perfect, and therefore there cannot be such a thing as musical harmony within the limits of his narrow logic-ridden mind. God has endowed mankind with reasoning powers which are able to demonstrate to every fair-minded, sane individual his deficiency of any special sense, if such an imperfection has been inflicted upon him by some interference with developmental law. Should he ignore lightly the accumulated testimony of the many millions of believers down the centuries who have died affirming that they have known God and held close communion with him, that they had constantly approached him in prayer and supplication, and that in innumerable instances these prayers had been answered, then most certainly the gravest responsibility rests upon him for seeking out every explanation of his being unable to find out God for himself. This is the attitude of the truly scientific mind of the great thinker, who, when these experiences were unfounded to him by a pious friend, found expression in the confession, "You have got something which I have not got." Upon these grounds, therefore, there is, humanly speaking, every hope for the atheist, as soon as his intellect and reason accept the solemn reality of his deprivation, just as the colorblind and music-deaf individuals must do, unless they be imbeciles or fools. He may say, if I accept the fact of the existence of a God, I cannot accept the Bible, because there are miracles recorded throughout its pages, and these phenomena are antagonistic to all the laws of nature. You explain that science teaches us that there can be no real change, suspension, or reversion of these laws. For as we saw in our previous address, every miracle must have been performed through the operation of these very laws, guided by the unerring hand of him who first called them into being before the dawn of creation. If he accept this, he may next ask, do you expect any intelligent creature to believe that if there be a creator in some distant planet where he has his heaven, he can communicate with man and hear his feeble voice? Therefore, as this is scientifically impossible, I cannot believe in either inspiration or prayer. Ah, my friend, only yesterday, look at the teaching of your idle science. You were informed that two men had talked across two continents with an ocean rolling between by means of wireless telegraphy. And scientists say that in the ether there is no obstruction. 1,000,000 miles are as one furlong, and we are trying to get a message back from Mars. It requires an instrument at each end properly attuned. But alas, poor unbeliever, your receiver is imperfect or broken. He shifts his position again and exclaims, do you expect me to swallow such a heresy as prophecy? Yes, my friend, few things are easier if you only accept the Bible as you accept many other far less authenticated histories, and reject any record in it which is of doubtful date, so that you can be certain that the event did not occur before the prophecy was uttered. You'll find their things foretold from 500 to 1,000 years before they were fulfilled to the letter and to the very day. To summarize, even at the risk of wearing you by repetition, I have attempted to give you a theory or working hypothesis that belief in God and in revelation as a special sixth sense breathed into man at that stage of evolution where the Genesis narrative comes in, when he was transformed from a member of the brute creation and became a living soul. We have looked into the composite nature of the two most important senses, sight and hearing. The aberrations or anomalies which we met with in the cases of color blindness and music deafness, I've tried to show you are analogous to what we meet with in individuals who have been born without a perfect development of the sixth or God sense, which, like the other senses, is a more or less composite one. It may have struck you that it would have simplified matters merely to compare God blindness, say, with the case of those individuals born totally blind or deaf. I did not do so because, in the first place, the comparison would not be likely to convince the unbeliever who never dreams that he has any defect whatever in his senses, just as every colorblind person and music deaf person has to wait for years before he discovers his deficiency, and many of them go to the grave without suspecting their deprivations. In the second place, you will remember that at the start I warned you that I considered it a rarity to find a man born totally God-blind. Such an individual is a sort of freak. Possibly no man is born absolutely God-blind. Every degree of imperfection exists, and by reasoning from strict analogy, we can in this way explain every variety or shade of unbelief. Since the 18th century, Germany has occupied the unenviable position of standing at the head of the list of nations in which unbelief had reached its highest development. It is an interesting fact that Germany stands at the head of all other countries today, and the enormous number of her inhabitants who are myopic or short-sighted. We have lately witnessed for the first time in history vast armies of bespectacled men. Some of you may like to ask me, is there any relationship between their deficiency in the seeing sense and of the special sense about which we have been speaking? I would not like to push the analogy, whether we regard this as a coincidence or as what a philosopher would classify as a correlation of growth of one thing we can feel certain. Their incapacity of accepting God because of their unbelief turned the entire nation on the path of the discovery of a new deity. Him they found, him they enthroned, and him they worshipped as the God of might. This moral myopia or short-sightedness was permitted by the far-seeing ruler of the universe to lead them a certain distance, but no further, towards world empire. We cannot but believe that the poisonous effect of the higher criticism had sapped the moral fiber of the people of Germany and was the main cause of its ruin. It can safely be predicted that this ruin shall characterize the Republic till it returns to the acceptance of the true God and obeys his laws. We might as safely predict that the entire fabric of German criticism awaits a similar fate. Probably in a comparatively short time, few, if any, entitled to call themselves scholars will be found to support its assumptions. Before we dismiss rationalism, which is the parent or starting point or excuse for all the varieties of unbelief, and which has led its votaries far beyond the bounds of reason and sane sense into a soul-destroying quagmire, let us not forget that there is a higher rationalism, that of the true Christian believer who accepts the divine revelation. This is forcibly and truthfully put by Sir Robert Anderson when he says, "The position of the Christian is an intelligible one. Though he believes in the unseen and unprovable, his faith is strictly rational. For assuming a divine revelation, belief is the highest act of reason. The Christian maintains such a claim, and that, if it be assented to, his position is unassailable. But if God speaks, then skepticism gives place to faith, nor is this a mere begging of the question. The proof that the voice is really divine must be absolute and conclusive. In such circumstances, skepticism betokens mental or moral degradation, and faith is not the abnegation of reason, but the highest act of reason." One word in conclusion: the possession of this sixth special sense we may rightly regard as a gift from our Heavenly Father, co-equal with the gift of his only begotten Son. Indeed, with all reverence, we might say it is a greater boon bestowed upon mankind than the cross and the empty sepulchre, because had he not endowed us with this divine faculty or sense which enables us to believe, the atonement would have been a failure. Man would have been utterly unable to accept for himself the fact of the redeeming sacrifice. We should regard it as the Holy Spirit within us, which alone can bring us to Christ. No man can say that Jesus is the Lord, but by the Holy Ghost. So our conception of belief is certainly not at variance with Paul's teaching. As we realize the value of this sense, our hearts should continually go out in grateful thanks to the giver of every good thing. But I must utter a word of warning lest anyone should mistake my meaning. If my words have been helpful to any honest doubter, if they have given confidence to any auditor who has felt that his faith was weak, something more remains for me to say. The sense, power, or capacity of accepting the fact of a living personal God and his revealed word never yet has saved a soul from death or added a single star to the Savior's glittering crown. It is only by fully exercising this gift, or since one and for all, coming confidently to Jesus as a little child and taking his yoke upon you, that you can become sons of God and joint heirs of eternal life with him. He must ever keep in mind that this sixth special sense has been given to us so that we may be able to believe in the truth of the revelation of himself, which he has delivered to his chosen people. Our possession of it in no way lessens the importance of, or necessity for, revelation, but without it, revelation would be valueless. I have spoken of the responsibility of a God-blind or a God-deaf man, but reflect how awful is our responsibility if we be already in possession of this gift of faith sense. During this feeble appeal of mine, he has been knocking at the door of some sinner's heart and stretching out the everlasting arms of love to receive him. I appeal to any doubter or hesitator reached by my words to exercise his faith and accept him now and forever. Step across the threshold of this world's slavery and sadness and enter into a new and glorious kingdom of liberty and joy to reign with him through all eternity.
Chapter 4: Prophecy and Unbelief. The following brief study of the nature and functions of prophecy is necessarily more or less incomplete, as the main object before us is to clear the way for the better understanding of the predictions contained in the book of Daniel. The common view, not only the view of the man in the street, but often that also of the man in the pew, is that prophecy is mainly a matter of the foretelling of events. If you take this narrow view, you are liable to find yourself confusing prophecy with soothsaying, divination, and fortune-telling, and the various methods of prying into the future which are forbidden by the law of Moses, and which history proves were practiced by the heathen peoples from the earliest times. The Bible tells us also that these practices were resorted to by the Israelites themselves. We need to pause to speculate about the possibility of a faculty being possessed by some aberrantly developed individuals or mediums, by means of which they can foretell future events. If such a power exists, and it is more than doubtful, it is something very different, being condemned by that very law which was the governing principle in the conduct and life of every true prophet in the Old Testament record, save perhaps Balaam. There shall not be found among you any one that useth divination. And then follows the denunciation of 6 other special methods of spying into the unknown future. Primarily, the prophet's function was to instruct the people by revealing God's law to them, to unfold the meaning of his kingdom and his dealings with them, and especially to warn them of the results of disobedience and idolatry. The mere predictions or foretelling of events still in the future, and of stating when these events would occur, must be regarded as of great, but yet of less, importance than the revelation of himself and of his kingdom. The first cardinal point in the study of prophecy is to grasp that the prophetic office was confined or limited to the Hebrews. These were a chosen race, an elect people, a pure theocracy, a state or nation with God himself as the ruler or head. There is no instance in the Bible of a prophet being sent to the heathen world with a message, save in the case of Jonah. Many predictions occur about the fate of heathen nations, but these always had close relationship with the destinies of Israel, and they never were propagated as a gospel to those nations. Daniel had his visions and wrote his prophecies in Babylon, the then home of the Jews. We may regard the entire machinery of prophecy contained in the oracles of God as a mighty organ with the pipes as the long succession of men from Enoch to Malachi and onwards to John of Patmos. God stretches forth his hand from time to time and touches the keyboard when the mighty diapason rolls out with the thunder of Sinai, unfolding the law, or the plaintive notes of Jeremiah bewail the sins and desolations of his people. Anon come pealing forth stern notes of anger or trumpet tones of warning, but ever in the interludes he plays on those keys which breathe sweet symphonies of hope and comfort, predicting the coming of a Messiah, and swelling into the triumphant promises of a return of his chosen people to the cherished land that he had sworn to be the heritage of their ancestors and their descendants forever. I employ this figure not as a mere poetic flourish, but because my study of prophecy has convinced me that the prophets were the mere mouthpieces of God's revelation, and that in many cases, especially in their remote prophecies, they had little or possibly no understanding of the real meaning of the message delivered through them, as we observe in some of Daniel's visions. They spake as the Holy Spirit breathed upon them in sleep, in dreams or visions of the night, or as in the wakeful hours he played upon his chosen instrument. The communication was, however, always accompanied by an unmistakable sensation which convinced the prophet that God had spoken to him directly and given him the command immediately to arise and proclaim the message which he had received. The nature of our brief survey compels me to confine myself to that part of prophecy which is entirely concerned with prediction, or the foretelling of events. Looking at the subject from this narrower standpoint, we can easily divide these prophecies into two groups: those which are yet unfulfilled, and those which have already come to pass. The unfulfilled predictions apply to the latter days, to the time of the end. This is a department of theology usually termed as eschatology and apocalyptic. As it does not immediately concern us directly, a few brief remarks will enable us to put it aside till we arrive at Daniel's predictions. There are four chief unfulfilled prophecies in the Bible. 1. That foretelling the return of the children of Israel to the land of promise, not to Palestine, but to that larger tract of country extending from the river Euphrates to the Mediterranean Sea, at present occupied by British troops and capable of supporting, several times over, the numbers of Jews scattered throughout the world at present. This is a prophecy repeated and re-repeated over and over again, and running through many of the books in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. It is one of the most definite and unmistakable predictions in the sacred record. 2. The fall of Antichrist. The first little horn of Daniel, believed by the majority of biblical students since the Reformation to refer to Papal Rome, but this view is stoutly opposed by many profound scholars. 3. The fall of Daniel's second little horn, arising in the northwest. This is regarded by many as applying to the Mohammedan power. 4. The second coming of Jesus Christ. Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye looking into heaven? This Jesus which was received up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as ye behold him going into heaven. I think it is certain that all these four predictions will be fulfilled about the same time at the termination of the Gentile period. Tomorrow morning we may see him come in the clouds, or it may be that this glorious sight is reserved for our descendants 1,000 years hence. I have my own deep convictions on the subject, which are interwoven with every fiber of my being, but I know that millions of devout Christians during the last 19 centuries have had similar convictions as they pondered over the closing words in the sacred volume. Yea, I come quickly. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. The fulfilled prophecies stand upon an entirely different plane. They are so numerous that it is difficult to count them. When I sat down yesterday to think over this address, I foolishly thought of enumerating them with a brief remark on the most important ones. But time will only permit a few words to be said of their general character. If I voiced a feeling which has been growing stronger in my breast of late years, it must be in words which would sound as an indictment of the teachers of all our Christian churches. If I accuse them of a great dereliction of duty, I shall state the reason of my charge, and if I be doing them an injustice, may God forgive my presumption and erroneous judgment. I regard these fulfilled prophecies of the Bible as only third in value to the gift of Jesus and to our sixth special sense of faith in God. Indeed, I am tempted at times to appraise them equally, but I think this is probably going too far. I cannot remember ever hearing a single sermon preached in any church on the value or general importance of the testimony of these fulfilled purposes of God. We hear incidental references to a few of them, and of course powerful disclosures upon one or two of the messianic prophecies. But, for the most part, my personal experiences lead me to believe that their value as a whole is taken for granted. The honest doubter who approaches the study of this subject with a perfectly open mind will find not only enough to give him faith, but as he profoundly studies all these fulfilled predictions, even his newly acquired faith will develop into a certainty, and he will lift his hands in grateful adoration, crying out, "O my God, thou hast planted my feet upon a rock which never can be moved. I know now that everything which can happen to me and to the whole human race since the dawn of creation has been beneficently planned by Thee from the beginning. Not a sparrow can fall without Thy knowledge and consent." How comes it, then, that so little is made of these priceless treasures? Two reasons for this neglect are forthcoming. One is that the entire subject of unfulfilled prophecy has become a matter of ridicule and jest, because of the writings of the prophecy mongers who constitute themselves not interpreters, but prophets who fix with confidence and certainty the exact date to the day and hour when these predictions shall see their accomplishment. There has perhaps been no year since the days of Gregory the Great, who was the predecessor of the first pope, which has not been singled out by these fanatics and confidently prophesied as the terminal year of this planet's existence, nay, even the very day being fixed with certainty. For the greater part of my own life I was under the influence or spell of this well-merited ridicule and prevented from making any serious study of prophecy. I shall give you one of several personal experiences with these modern prophets. Some years ago, on my visiting a professional friend and devout Christian gentleman who had seen a good deal of the world and come into contact with several of the religions of the East, he solemnly informed me that the end of the world was to be exactly 6 or 8 weeks from that day and at the hour of noon. I had no other reason to doubt his sanity, but in order to test his sincerity, I reminded him that a week previously he had told me that he was negotiating for a lease for his residence. His reply was that he was compelled to do this to satisfy his wife, who had not mastered the science of prophecy as he had. About 10 days afterwards he drove up very hurriedly to my door, and, bursting into my study, he proclaimed that he had news for me from London. That morning he had got a circular letter from the secretary of his school of prophets, which showed that a serious mistake had been made in their calculations. They had forgotten to allow for the loss of the day when the sun stood still on Gibeon and the moon in the valley of Ajalon. Therefore the final catastrophe would be deferred for 24 hours more, and he was anxious that I should not suffer disappointment on the particular Wednesday which he had previously named. I recalled to memory a book which I had read in my boyhood, the title of which was, I think, Louis Napoleon, the Destined Monarch of the World, and another by Piazzi Smith, F.R.S., on the predictions enshrined in the Great Pyramid, and I thereupon vowed that if any of these modern prophets came before me as a physician, I would not hesitate to sign a committal for admission to a mental hospital. Quite a large crop of them has sprung up during and since the war. If by any flight of imagination I could conceive myself in the exalted position of a minister of the gospel, I think I could not muster up enough moral courage to preach on these apocalyptic or eschatological predictions, forecasting the time of the end in the face of the discredit and ridicule at present existing. I might feel constrained to speak about the end of the times, which is quite another matter. The subject is one which should only be approached by what I would call level-headed people, and we are distinctly told that the wise shall understand them in the latter days, though the language is purposely couched in words of mystery, so that we may not know the exact time or the particular manner in which the fulfillment is to be accomplished. When the accomplishment is effected, every wise man and fool will be convinced that these final happenings were planned and predicted by the great architect of the universe many thousands of years before. Some of the fulfilled prophecies were clothed in the same mysterious language as we shall see later on, and for similar reasons. The second cause of the neglect of the study and teaching of the fulfilled prophecies is a very interesting and important one, and requires to be considered at great length. Here we are brought up directly face to face with the German higher criticism and its methods, and have to confront the host of deists who, though they acknowledge the existence of a God, deny the possibility of all inspiration, and hence of prophecy. According to this system, if any event the subject of a prophecy comes to pass, its fulfillment must be a pure coincidence, or the prediction must have been such as any wise human seer might have made from his knowledge of the trend of events occurring around him, or it was a fraudulent record of an event which had already happened before the prediction was made. This latter is the favorite method employed by the higher critics, and by which they have created their baseless fabric which is to replace our Bible. With an ingenuity which one would say was truly satanic or diabolical, only we must give Satan his due. Whatever we may think of his majesty, he is not a German critic. With this cunning these philosophers have altered the chronology of nearly every book in the Old Testament, including the Pentateuch, which must have been written, they say, after the return from the Babylonian exile, about 500 years B.C. That is more than 1,000 years after the time of Moses, and Moses, you will remember, with these critics, was never a personality, only an astral myth. At first this theory about the date of the earlier books was built upon what they called the fact that there was no possibility of such a thing as writing in the time of Moses, much less in the age of the patriarchs. But the explorer brought to light a long document written on stone by Amraphel, one of the kings mentioned in the Genesis account of Abraham's great battle. Nothing daunted by this incontrovertible evidence, they proceeded to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that all the older books were written at least 1,000 years after Moses. The former theory having been thus exploded, a new one had to be discovered. This was entirely speculative and absolutely visionary. I must digress for a moment, as the mention of this futile argument has a distinct bearing on our subject. These unbelieving critics, denying revelation, maintain that the religion of the Hebrews gradually grew, evolved, or developed entirely by human aid out of the ancient myths of the old heathen nations surrounding them, a kind of adaptation of the Darwinian theory applied to the growth of religion. Therefore it was utterly impossible that the advanced ideas of a personal God recorded in the first 5 books of the Bible could have been known or current before the period of the exile. Therefore these books were most certainly written after the return, and in this sweeping assumption is included even the book of the Psalms. Our next silencing fact which these critics had to face is a biblical record so exact and minute that one is almost forced to believe that it was inserted by the finger of God himself, who had foreseen the appearance on the earth during the later days of this type of Antichrist. Israel had lapsed into the grossest forms of idolatry during the centuries between the death of Solomon and the exile. The temple worship and the edifice itself were falling into ruin when, about 50 years before the captivity, the good King Josiah ascended the throne of David in Jerusalem and started to repair the dilapidations in Solomon's temple. In a partially ruined portion of the sacred building, Hilkiah the priest discovered the long-lost book of the law, Deuteronomy. He brought it to the king. Huldah the prophetess, the scribes, elders, priests, and the entire congregation of Jews were summoned to hear the lost law unfolded daily to them, and a great religious revival sprung up. How do the critics meet this succinct narrative? They unblushingly affirm, in order to support their dogma about the date of the law, that the book was a forgery, a fraud of the priests, in order to impose on the people better terms for their own material or worldly prosperity. That a palpable fraud of this kind could have succeeded is beyond the belief of any fair-minded man. Moreover, the position of the priests suffered rather than gained by the discovery of the lost book. Not one scintilla of evidence, or even of probability, has ever been produced of the fraudulent nature of this incident. Nevertheless, with even greater unanimity than is visible in their other fictions, the forgery is not put forward as a theory or hypothesis, but as an unquestionable fact. It is one of the foundation stones of their creed, and they constantly reiterate that it is a fact now accepted by all scholars. All scholars may be accepted as meaning all unbelievers who scribble on only purely rationalist lines. I believe that I have duly examined every argument of these men, and I have not found a single statement regarding the date and authenticity of the first 6 books of the Bible which rests upon any firmer basis than this subterfuge of regarding the lost book of the law being a palpable forgery. We shall now examine their next argument or assumption. The higher critics having established to their satisfaction that the Hebrews had no law for the guidance of their theocracy till the book of Deuteronomy, forged by the high priest Hilkiah, was given to them in the reign of Josiah, next proceed to wipe out every inspired or prophetic element in the remaining books, including the laws for the priestly offerings of the temple as laid down in Leviticus. This they achieve by a similarly convenient theory of forgery by assuming that this book, with the chief parts of Exodus and Numbers, was written by Ezra about 460 BC and imposed upon the Jews on his return to Jerusalem as the genuine law of Moses. A recent writer, Reverend J. Pelletian, refutes this assumption by archaeological evidence of an indisputable nature. A colony of Jews existed in Elephantine in southern Egypt in the Pathos district. They are mentioned as early as the time of Hosea, who prophesied before the reign of Uzziah, and more specifically, they are named in the first verse of Jeremiah 44 and also in Isaiah. The colony therefore existed some centuries before the time of Ezra. A few years ago, some papyrus letters were found in the ruins of Elephantine showing that they possessed a temple like that of Jerusalem, dedicated to Jehovah in the times of the kings of Egypt, certainly before Persian rule. These letters show that they had also the three principal Jewish sacrifices named in words identical with those described in the book of Leviticus: meal offerings, incense, and burnt offerings. These sacrifices were conducted as in Leviticus by the priests. Another letter states that they kept the feast of the Passover. Thus, Mr. Pelletian states that all this shows us that Elephantine Jews had their temple in the time of the Egyptian pharaohs and observed the Mosaic law as regards sacrifices and priests a long time before Ezra lived. Neither were these novel practices, for the people were deeply affected at their inability to keep the old Mosaic law. So the law of Moses must have existed a long time before Ezra lived. Therefore, the assumption of the higher critics has no foundation in fact. Thus, one by one, the assumptions of the destructive critics are being proved to be baseless by monumental or archaeological evidences brought to light by the spade and pickaxe of the explorer. When we come to examine their so-called evidence of the forgery of the book of Daniel, 400 years after his time, we shall see how every shred of their arguments is met by the stern truths written on stone during the lifetime of the Jewish exile and prophet. This method of destroying our Bible has at least the merit of simplicity, as most ingenious devices turn out ultimately simple when analyzed. Make the date of the books as written 1,000 years after they were in reality composed by their inspired authors, and you enable the destructive critic to affirm that the fulfilled prophecies which are contained in them were obviously not predictions at all, but fraudulent narratives written after the facts or events had happened. Not all predictions, however, for we have, for example, the Messianic prophecies, which we shall examine carefully in detail. These they attempt to discredit by an even bolder method. They deny that they have any reference to Christ at all, being figurative references to various conditions of the Jewish nation or individuals wrapped up in the extravagant imagery of the ancient Hebrew seers. When a specific utterance is met with which cannot be explained away by these ordinary assumptions, there is usually little hesitation in condemning it as a later gloss or interpolation, or minimizing its importance by some generalization as that employed by Canon Chain when he says that Jewish literature is mostly borrowed mythology. I fear that many of our religious teachers feel that if they employ as a text any of these early prophecies, such as the dying predictions of Jacob or that of the 430 years in Egypt, They are likely to be reminded of the opinion of a great biblical scholar like Stade that there is no evidence that the Israelites were ever in Egypt at all. A similar objection may be made about expounding the prophecies regarding Canaan, Shem, Ham, Japheth, Esau, Ishmael, and other patriarchs. It would seem that the present-day attitude is to regard any teacher who would attempt to draw a lesson from the fulfillment of these prophecies in Genesis as a man behind the times and ignorant of the advances made by modern rationalistic scholars and accepted authorities. Shift the dice box as they may, for it is a pure game of guess with these critics, and there stares them in the face such an utterance as, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his foot, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the obedience of the people be." But for what we have received through the promise made to Abraham, "In thee shall all the peoples of the earth be blessed," we today would know probably as much about God as Stanley's little men of the forest did, or the American Indians when discovered by Columbus. Let us cease to despise the poor Jew. Let us remember that of the 66 books of our Bible, every one was written by a descendant of Abraham, except the Gospel of Luke and the Acts. Job's author was almost certainly a Hebrew. Let us not forget that the early Christian church was almost entirely composed of Jews. We are too apt to forget that the religion of the Hebrews, as laid down in the Old Testament and perfected and consummated in the New, is now the religion of all the civilized nations of the earth.
Chapter 5, the Messianic Prophecies. The central point on which the whole scheme of divine revelation rests or revolves is to be found by a study of the prophecies which foretold the advent of Jesus Christ. Professor Flint, in his St. Giles lecture, condenses the whole subject into a few pregnant sentences. All the parts of the Old Testament system contribute each in its place to raise, sustain, and guide faith in the coming of a mysterious and mighty Savior, a perfect prophet, perfect priest, and perfect king, such as Christ alone of all men can be supposed to have been. This broad general fact, this vast and strange correlation of correspondence, cannot be in the least affected by questions of the higher criticism as to the authorship, time of origination, and mode of composition of the various books of the Old Testament. Answer all these questions in the way which the boldest and most rationalistic criticism of Germany or Holland ventures to suggest, accept in every properly critical question the conclusions of the most advanced critical schools, and what will follow? Merely this, that those who do so will have, in various respects, to alter their views as to the manner and method in which the ideal of the Messiah's person, work, and kingdom was, point by point, line by line, evolved and elaborated. There will not, however, be a single messianic word or sentence, not a single line or feature, the fewer, in the Old Testament. As I said once before, as regards fundamentals, in contrast to these alteration of dates, textual corrections, etc., there can be no compromise with the German higher criticism. Either the Book of God, as we call it, is an inspired record, or it is a fraud like the lost book of the law found in the dilapidated temple, or the imposition of the other books of Moses on the Jewish people by Ezra. If you wish a demonstration of where the compromising spirit will lead you, Read some of the papers delivered recently at the Conference of Churchmen at Girton College, Cambridge. The pure, undiluted doctrine of advanced Unitarianism is unblushingly unfolded. Running through some of the addresses, I have read every one of them in the official report. There is advanced the compromise. Jesus was the Son of God, but every Christian is also a son of God in the same sense, and so on, and so on. Pages of hair-splitting metaphysical speculation about the extent of his much manhood and little Godhead, how his knowledge of the demoniacal possessions which he conquered was no better than that of the men around him, and his knowledge of the future was limited and imperfect. But incredible as it may seem, though there are skeptical references to the virgin birth, which cannot be proved, there is scarcely a word about his own prediction of his death and rising again in 3 days, or of the unquestionable fact of his resurrection and ascension witnessed by so many. We cannot but hang down our heads in shame when we think that the repudiation of such heresy was left to the prelates of the Roman Church. We can distinguish a distinct difference between the aims or objects of the old prophecies, whilst all of them differed widely from the heathen soothsaying in being never employed with the intention of satisfying an idle curiosity, but for the revelation of divine truth and for the furtherance of the kingdom of God. Nevertheless, we constantly find short-time predictions which have no relationship to that one divine event to which the whole creation moves. Such are the prophecy of Sennacherib's catastrophe, the speedy death of the false prophet in 1 Kings 13, the fate of Jezebel, and scores of others in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Chronicles. These predictions were made obviously to establish the authenticity of the divine message by the prophet, and their speedy fulfillment was a guarantee of the weightier messages delivered by the same herald, being directly from God himself. The same object was clearly visible in some of the long-time predictions. Thus, Daniel foretold the fate of the Babylonian, Median, Persian, and Greek empires. It was probably the divine intention that as these predictions were fulfilled to the very letter during the succeeding centuries, the faith in a coming Messiah would grow stronger and stronger up till the Roman period. Much has been written about the style of the language used in biblical prophecy. As a rule, it may be said when the predicted event is close at hand, the language is so clear and unmistakable that the event, when it happens, is immediately recognized as the subject of the prediction. It is usually otherwise when the events foretold are very remote. Here, the prophet is face to face with the difficulty of expounding a message or vision, which has no resemblance to the things around him in words which would be intelligible to his auditors or contemporaries. As in the vision of St. Paul, the revelation was in unspeakable words, which it was not lawful for man to utter, hence the introduction of symbols. And it is the use of symbolic language which has made the book of the Revelation of St. John almost a sealed oracle. No one can treat the subject of prophecy without having ever in his mind the messianic predictions. We may perhaps best get a view of their importance to mankind by striving to conceive what would be left to us if they were removed from the Old Testament. Truly a mighty maze without a plan, a world without sun, moon, or stars. And yet the very existence of these prophecies has been disputed and has proved a difficulty, a stumbling block, and a rock of offense to many thousands of earnest and honest doubters, who have grieved in bitter anguish as they found it impossible to believe that any single one of them bore an unmistakable message from God about a future Redeemer of sinful men. The unbeliever acclaims that if God meant that these special predictions should be applied to the coming of his Son, Jesus Christ, the language in which they were couched must have been clear, definite, and unmistakable. Many a believer, moreover, has grave doubts about some few of them, which have been insisted upon by divines as tests of orthodoxy. I shall meet these difficulties at once by accepting the argument about the vagueness of many of the prophecies affirmed by various commentators as belonging to the messianic group. Nay, I shall go further and shock some of my auditors by condemning the attitude of any Christian who holds to each single messianic prediction as if his eternal salvation depended upon the acceptance of it. It was an absolute necessity that there must have been a free will choice given to every Jew to accept or reject the Messiah. If Daniel, Isaiah, or any other great prophet had proclaimed in clear and unmistakable language the year, the day, the hour, and the exact spot on the earth where Christ's birth was to take place, his mission would have been a failure, an impossible thing. The Jewish hierarchy would have immediately accepted him, and the entire Jewish race would have followed their lead like a flock of sheep through a gap, and there would have been no scope for the exercise of a personal faith. Exactly the same thing would have taken place as that which caused the greatest catastrophe which the Christian world has ever witnessed, when the Roman emperor issued his decree that paganism was to be rejected and every citizen was to become a Christian. The church almost perished. If you look at any ancient map, you will see that the entire Mediterranean littoral was thickly studded with viral church centers, which extended eastwards into the hinterland of Syria and Asia, southwards into Africa, and northwards into Europe. There was no room left for the growth of individual faith, which almost immediately began to wither, and gradually moral death set in to prepare the way for the false faith of Muhammad and his kingdom. The messianic prophecies were obviously therefore for a wise purpose, clothed in obscure language. If we attempt to put ourselves mentally in the position of a devout Jew of, say, 3,000 years ago, we certainly would have got a firm hold of the cardinal belief that a deliverer or Messiah was to come sometime in the near or distant future. But under what conditions his kingdom was to be established, what his personality was to be like, and with what attributes he would be endowed, these indeed were almost inscrutable mysteries. It seems impossible that the Jewish mind could have conceived the idea that their deliverer was to suffer the ignominy of a criminal's death, notwithstanding the warnings in the Psalms and in the book of Isaiah. Yet every one of these obscure or mysterious predictions with his advent became as luminous as the sun. They fulfilled to the letter the divine purpose and effected their object, to put the seal of incontrovertible testimony on his personality and mission. Once he had appeared, taken together, they form the most marvelously complete demonstration of the fulfillment of any scheme or plan, either human or divine, which has ever been witnessed in the world's checkered history. You're all familiar with the toy maps made in detached pieces of wood to teach children something of the geography of the Earth's surface. If you had only one of these pieces in your hand, you could make little or nothing of it, but all pieced together give you a perfect picture of each continent, ocean, sea, and island. So God intends that we should view these different predictions, which have been revealed to his children, and thus get a complete view of the oneness of the Old and New Testaments, which is the rock on which Christianity is built. Let us glance briefly at the complete picture, dealing only with the most striking pieces of the divine mosaic, beginning with the primeval promise made to Adam before his expulsion from the garden, that his seed should bruise the serpent's head. We trace it through Noah, Abraham, and Isaac. In Jacob, we get the definite promise that the deliverer was to arise from amongst the tribe of Judah. Moses tells the chosen people that the Lord God would raise them up a prophet like unto himself, and there was not a prophet who ever resembled Moses till Jesus came. Next, God speaks through the heathen Balaam and tells Balak that, behold, a star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It was the frequent references to the sure covenant which the Lord had made with David, whose throne was to last forever and ever, which we get in Samuel and the Psalms, and in Isaiah, which led the devout Jews to look for the coming Messiah as springing from the lineage of David. Here I would like to touch upon a matter which has proved a sore trouble and difficulty to many a sincere believer. I refer to the two genealogies of Jesus Christ, one given by Matthew and contradicted in several important links by Luke's family tree. Out of this, both Jews and infidels have attempted to make great capital. It is a very difficult subject to investigate, and I have gone into each link in both the chains, and I feel certain that it can be thoroughly established that Matthew's genealogy is that of Joseph and Luke's is that of Mary. Here again, we can get perfect harmony in a matter of vital importance to the fundamentals of Christianity. Let us return to the Old Testament prophecies regarding the more personal or individualist details. Isaiah 7:14 foretells, "The Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." His home was to be in Galilee, where the people who walked in darkness were to see a great light. He was, however, to be born in Bethlehem, as prophesied by Micah about 700 years before his birth, in the remarkably specific statement, "And thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, which are little to be amongst the thousands of Judah, out of these shall one come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting." Between the time of his birth and that of his ministry, he was to be called out of Egypt. He was to preach good tidings unto the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives, and the acceptable year of the Lord. Zechariah prophesies, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, even upon a colt, the foal of an ass. He shall speak peace unto the nations, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth." Isaiah foretells that he was to be despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men would hide their faces. He was to be wounded for our transgressions, a lamb led to the slaughter and dumb before his shears. He was to be scourged, and by his stripes we are to be healed. He was sold, as prophesied in Zechariah 11:12, for 30 pieces of silver, which were to be cast to the potter. In Matthew, this prophecy, 27:9, of the betrayal is quoted as from Jeremiah, as sometimes the Jews loosely referred to the division of the Bible containing the works of the prophets as the book of Jeremiah, because the writing of this prophet stood first on their list. We have the remarkable prediction detailing his death with the wicked and his burial in the sepulchre of the rich Arimathean in Isaiah 53:9. The psalmist tells us that his soul was not to be left in Sheol. Moreover, he was to arise again, for his body was not to suffer corruption. Psalm 16:10. In the first verse of Psalm, example, there is a prophecy which is of much importance and of the greatest value. He was to sit on the right hand of the Lord in heaven till his enemies became his footstool. That this verse, in its peculiar wording, is to be regarded as a prophecy, not only of his ascension, but of his divinity, is proven by the Redeemer's own quotation of it when arguing with the unbelieving Pharisees. He put the question to them, "What think ye of Christ? Whose son is he?" as narrated in Matthew 22:45. The writer to the Hebrews uses this same verse as proof of the divine nature of Christ in the first chapter of his epistle. In addition to these specific prophecies, we have many others which were regarded as fulfilled at the crucifixion, as for example, the figurative directions given about the paschal lamb for the Passover feast in Exodus 12:46. Not a bone of him shall be broken. See John 19:36. And again in Zechariah 12:10. They shall look upon him whom they have pierced. I have left one prophecy to the last. It is for me the most interesting in the Old Testament, for reasons which I shall mention presently. It is the 22nd Psalm. Here we get a startling and thrilling picture of the crucifixion, as if it were painted by an eyewitness, though written more than 1,000 years before the event. Let us note before we read it that in all human probability, death by the method of crucifixion had never been witnessed by a Jew in the time of David. As you know, their death sentence was carried out by stoning, though they did not hesitate to hang their captive enemies. I can find no evidence in Josephus or any other ancient historian which could lead one to suspect that the Israelites were practically acquainted with this mode of punishment. The ferocious Assyrians probably practiced it occasionally, as the cultured Germans are said to have revived it in the early stages of the late war. If we are correct in this assumption, it will greatly enhance the value and force of the prophecy. Let us solemnly strive to visualize the crucifixion scene. Though it cannot be done without harassing our feelings, we see Jesus for hours nailed to the cross by hands and feet, tortured with pain, suffering parching thirst, naked under a burning eastern sun, below a jeering rabble bitterly mocking him with taunts to come down and save himself. Vinegar and gall are thrust up to his scorched lips. A small group of mercenary wretches are struggling to secure possession of the few articles of clothing which had been removed from his body before the nailing process and the elevation of the cross into the hole in the ground. Think of the agony caused by the penetration of the coarse and strong nails or bolts as they are driven in through flesh and bones, and the awful jar to every nerve, joint, bone, and muscle, as the heavy cross of wood, with its victim attached, is lifted up and suddenly dropped down into the deep hole or socket in the ground. More than 1,000 years before, God had placed his fingers on the keyboard of his great organ of prophecy, and there pealed forth in notes of human anguish and woe words which we have no difficulty in realizing as if we were hearing our blessed Redeemer himself cry out from the cross. Let us reverently and with awe listen to him. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised of the people. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot the lip, they shake the head, saying, Commit thyself unto the Lord, let him deliver him. Seeing he delighteth in him, they gape upon me with their mouth, as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death, for dogs have compassed me. The assembly of evildoers have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them, and upon my vesture do they cast lots. They shall come and shall declare his righteousness unto a people that shall be born, that he hath done it. In the 69th Psalm, we find the only missing detail. Reproach hath broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. I looked for some to take pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They gave me also gall for my meat, and in my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. Heaven forbid that I should raise a doubt in the mind of any believer if what I am now going to say should do so. I shall lay the doubt at once. There was only one verse in the Bible which made my faith waver. It was the dying cry from the cross as recorded by Matthew and Mark. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? I believed in the divine nature of Jesus Christ. I believed that he was the Son of God, but how was it possible, being so, that he should accuse his Father of forsaking him? Though we who believe in his divinity have no difficulty in realizing the reality of his bodily suffering because of his human incarnation, the only refuge seemed to lie in the hope that these words were never uttered or were inaccurately reported, a method of interpretation which we condemn in the higher critics. Some theological controversialists attempt to explain this dying exclamation by pointing out that Christ's death, being an offspring for sin and as representing sin itself, must have produced a temporary alienation for the moment from God. Such an assumption or theory, to most simple minds, can bring little comfort or light, and to me appeared both unnatural and irreverent. Here was this 22nd Psalm of minute and detailed prophecy of the Savior's death. How often must he have read it and pondered over it during his sojourn on earth? Does it throw any light upon his mysterious death cry? I shall never forget the time and the place when this light burst upon myself on an afternoon in London when reading over the late Primate Alexander's lectures on the Psalms. The psalm opens with the exact words from the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I had not noticed the fact till then. With this light, we can feel that we are eyewitnesses of the scene so minutely detailed, can fancy that we hear Jesus after uttering this cry. Just before he expires, exclaim, read the 22nd Psalm, and you must now believe at last that it has all been foretold there, and I am he of whom your prophet spoke. We need have no difficulty in realizing that this opening verse of the psalm was merely David's own personal note of sorrow, expressed in the figurative language of the Hebrew prophets, directing attention to the divinely inspired message which he had received, probably without his having any clear conception of the depth of the marvelous revelation vouchsafed to him. We thus see that a careful study of the picture map of the world's Redeemer as constructed by the Old Testament prophets gives us minute details, many hundreds of years before his advent, of his birth, divinity, ministry, betrayal, passion, crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Is there anything missing in the wondrous series of predictions, which we have but too briefly summarized? Is there anything wanting to convince the most hardened unbeliever or the most unreasonable doubter? If there is, it can only be that a definite notification of the exact date of the Messiah's expected arrival on our planet is not included in the series of prophecies. This was left to the prophet Daniel to foretell, not to the year, month, or week, but to the very day and hour was the divine sacrifice predicted in the great central prophecy of the 70 weeks made by the Babylonian captive. This we shall see and minutely examine in a future study of the book of Daniel, but you must expect to find it veiled in language so mysterious that the believing Jew and the Gentile could only be certain of the truth of the tremendously important utterance after its actual occurrence. I have classified prophecy as divisible into the two biblical groups: those which have been already clearly and unmistakably fulfilled, and those still awaiting their fulfillment. There's a small group which belongs to either or both these groups. Let me conclude this lecture on prophecy with an example. I leave it with you as a message from the lips of Messiah himself. Without it, the unity of the Old and New Testaments could hardly be said to be complete. It is contained in a text with which every one of you is familiar since childhood, but perhaps few have ever realized or recognized it as a prophecy or prediction. I never fully identified it as such till one never to be forgotten spring afternoon in Palestine, though it is the most typical prophetic utterance handed down to the sons of men through our Bible. Strive to visualize the background which enabled it to start forward before me as a prophecy. I had walked over a part of the road traveled by his blessed feet from Nazareth village to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, when the sacred associations of the spot enabled me to call up a picture which was at first almost repellent of him who was the despised and rejected of men, a fugitive, and according to the respectable people of that time, a vagabond who had not where to lay his head, who wandered about accompanied by a small rabble of peasant fishermen. I see him lift up his hands and hear him utter a cry which must have sounded to those about him as the ravings of a distracted mind. It has already been fulfilled, and is today being fulfilled, and shall be continued to be fulfilled down the ages till we see him coming back again in the clouds. Think of it as a prophecy. As you walk home, let each of us ask himself, has it been fulfilled in me? Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my labor is light. Don't be tempted to hesitate or procrastinate by the erroneous conception of the yoke. Don't confuse it with the idea of the cross. It is but the kindest of all contrivances which makes the burden to be scarcely felt.